A reading from the first book of Kings. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. Then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. And they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he placed on us, and we will serve you." He said to them, "Go away for 3 days, then come again to me." So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the older men who had attended his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, "How do you advise me to answer this people?" They answered him, "If you will be a servant to this people today and serve them, and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever." But he disregarded the advice that the older men gave him, and consulted with the young men who had grown up with him and now attended him. He said to them, "What do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, 'Lighten the yoke that your father put on us'?" The young men who had grown up with him said to him, "Thus you should say to this people who spoke to you, 'Your father made our yoke heavy, but you must lighten it for us.' Thus you should say to them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the 3rd day, as the king had said, "Come to me again on the 3rd day." The king answered the people harshly. He disregarded the advice that the older men had given him and spoke to them according to the advice of the young men. "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, because it was a turn of affairs brought about by Yahweh that he might fulfill with his word, which Yahweh had spoken by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam, son of Nebat. When all Israel saw that the king would not listen to them, the people answered the king, "What share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel! Look now to your own house, O David." So Israel went away to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and resided there. He went out from there and built Penuel. Then Jeroboam said to himself, "Now the kingdom may well revert to the house of David. If this people continues to go up to offer sacrifices in the house of Yahweh at Jerusalem, the heart of this people will turn again to their master, King Rehoboam of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam of Judah." So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. He said to the people, "You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." He set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Mark. When Jesus and his disciples were on the way to Jerusalem, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And Jesus said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left hand, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the other 10 disciples heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them all and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." The Gospel of Christ.
So last week I talked about the religious background that could be responsible for much of the conflict we see in Israel and Palestine right now. And then I had said that it would be a good idea for us to also explore the political ramifications over the past 150 years that are also reasons for this conflict. And so we're going to do that today, but in a minute. Because I wasn't expecting this, but in reading the Hebrew Bible text for this morning, I think there's a connection that we can find that not only relates to what's happening in the Middle East right now, but also that relates to us with our own circumstances and situations as people. And so let's begin with what you heard Holly read earlier today. What is going on in this situation is Israel has had 3 kings as it has been united as a kingdom, under Saul, and then David's son Solomon. And now Solomon has passed away, and his son Rehoboam is next in line to be the king. And so Rehoboam is getting set to be made king, and another man named Jeroboam, who comes from the northern part of Israel, because Jerusalem is in the south, the capital city, is there with a number of other people who decide to approach Rehoboam and appeal to him as he's about to take the throne. And so they come up to Rehoboam and they say to him, "Look, Rehoboam, your father Solomon, he had a very heavy hand on us." What they mean by that is under the reign of Solomon, life was challenging for many of the Israelites because, well, for one, he had a lot of overhead. The scriptures tell us he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, so he had a lot of mouths to feed in his own household, which meant higher taxes, right? And then, of course, he had to build his palace and make it magnificent, which meant higher taxes, and not to mention labor to build the palace, so people having to come down from the north to help build the palace. And then, of course, Solomon is the one whose privilege it was to build the temple of Yahweh, this ornate and elaborate work of art that is meant to be the place where Yahweh dwelt. And, of course, that meant higher taxes and more labor. And so with this going on during the 40-year reign of Solomon, Jeroboam and the others are saying to his son Rehoboam, "Can you ease up a little bit? When you take the throne, can we have an easier time of it than Solomon had?" And so Rehoboam said, "Let me think about that. Come back in 3 days. I'll let you know what I think." And so then Rehoboam went to his older advisors. These are the people that advised Solomon as well. And so he talks to these elders and he says, "What do you guys think? You've heard what the people said. How should I respond?" And these older, wise advisors said to him, "Rehoboam, what you should do is consider this. If you respond kindly to the people and you listen to what they have said and you actually follow through and ease up on that burden, these people will serve you the rest of their lives, no problem." And he said, "Okay, thanks for your input." Then he turned to his younger advisors. These are his peers, his friends. They all went to the same frat in university. You know what I mean? Like, these are all his buddies. And he says, "What do you guys think? How should I respond to these people?" And they say, "Well, Rehoboam, you're the king. They should make sure that they know who the king is. Say to them, my little finger is bigger than my dad's legs. You thought he was tough on you. Just watch me and wait to see what I do." And so Jeroboam and the others came back after 3 days, and Rehoboam went with the advice of the younger advisors. He said to them, "Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I don't care. I'm the king. You're not. Deal with it." And so Jeroboam and the people go back north towards home, and they're saying, "What's the point of standing for this? This doesn't make any sense. What part do we have to play with these dudes? Forget this. Jeroboam was already recognized as being an influential person, and so he was made king of the 10 tribes in the north, and they just let Rehoboam be the king of the 2 tribes in the south. And so with this, the kingdom splits. And the northern kingdom has been disaffected by the southern kingdom, and so says, we want no part of you, we're going to do our own thing. And on the one hand, we can understand why Jeroboam and the others felt that way. It's disappointing that the kingdom had to be divided, but we can understand how it was that Jeroboam was upset at what Rehoboam was doing. But then Jeroboam went another step too far. He said, you know what, this is great. We can set up our capital here in Shechem and they can have Jerusalem. But if the people always have to keep going down to Jerusalem to the temple for, Passover and Yom Kippur and all of these key dates, then they're going to keep showing up in Rehoboam's territory and they're eventually going to find that, I guess Rehoboam really is the king and they're not going to be loyal to me. So Jeroboam decided, I got to stop that. We're going to set up our own worship center as well. And so he makes 2 golden calves and says to them, look, Israel, the gods that led you out of Egypt. Sound familiar? That's what happened back in Exodus. Moses on Mount Sinai, the people built this golden calf. Well, here Jeroboam builds 2 of them. He puts one in Dan, which is the city at the north of the territory, and one in Bethel, which is in the south part of the territory. So he's bookended the northern kingdom with these 2 idols, basically saying to the people, you don't have to go to Jerusalem anymore. We can do it our own way. And having done that, every king after him in the northern kingdom of Israel did not faithfully serve Yahweh and lead the people to follow Yahweh. And so in 722 BCE, the northern kingdom was eliminated by the Assyrian Empire, never having been faithful to Yahweh. Having said that, though, the southern kingdom didn't do a whole lot better. About 1/3 of their monarchs actually paid attention to Yahweh. But 2/3 decided to do their own thing anyway, so only 150 years later, the southern kingdom was defeated by Babylon in 586 BCE. The thing that we see in this scenario is there can be a reason why someone might be disaffected or upset at what someone else has done. There can be conflict that emerges for any number of reasons. And we can understand why there might be a reaction to that conflict, but one must be really careful not to let the reaction to the response to the other reaction cause a bigger problem that makes it a bigger mess. And ever since that day, it began the end, really, to the kingdom of Israel, the moment it divided between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Let's talk about Israel and Palestine now. I said last week there were many religious reasons, deep religious reasons why there'd be conflict there, but there are also merely political reasons as well over the past 150 years. And so in 1897, a man named Theodor Herzl had published a book that was arguing for the development of a state for the Jewish people. And what he basically said was, ever since the Roman Empire conquered Jerusalem in 70 CE and destroyed the temple, and then a few years later, the final Jewish holdouts in Masada brought themselves to an end, and the battle was done. From that day on, Israel has not had their own home. The Jews have not had their own country. And anywhere they've gone, they're living in somebody else's country. And when they gather together and come together as a community, as is natural to do, then they become a problem for the host nations. And so Jews have been persecuted, given a hard time, had a difficult time of it for the past 2,000 years. And so Herzl is saying we really ought to have a nation for these Jewish people. And why not have it be back where we started? And so this movement that Herzl began is known as Zionism. Mount Zion is where Jerusalem is located, and so he argues for the creation of a state for the Jews. Well, the British are quite pleased with his arguments, and they feel that he's onto something, and this makes a lot of sense. So in 1917, they write up what's called the Balfour Declaration, and they basically say, you know what, we're going to make sure this gets done for you. And then we see what happens next. Well, just before we get into what happens next, World War I is actually underway when the Balfour Declaration is happening. And what we need to understand is that before World War I, in fact, for a few hundred years before that, the area known as Turkey and the Middle East, including out towards Persia and stuff, is the property of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is a Muslim nation, essentially. That is what is left over from the Muslim caliphates from earlier on. Islam showed up 600 years after Jesus, and then after the Roman Empire fell, the Islamic world ended up having great influence all along northern Africa and up even into Spain. And eventually, this empire retracted and became ultimately the Ottoman Empire. When World War I started, before I get to that, in this Ottoman Empire, there were Jews and Christians and Muslims all living in Palestine and getting along reasonably well. Muslims honored Jews and Christians as being people of the book because all three faiths acknowledge the Hebrew Bible as being scripture. Muslims tend to think that the Hebrew Bible has been corrupted, but nevertheless, it's important. It talks about Abraham, and this kind of thing. And so Jews and Christians generally might have been taxed a little bit more, but otherwise pretty well tolerated. Things are pretty straightforward under the Ottoman Empire. But then World War I happens, and the Ottoman Empire picks the wrong side. And so when Germany is defeated in World War I, the Ottoman Empire is also defeated. And they are limited basically to Turkey, and the Middle East is now divided and assigned by the League of Nations to the French in the north and the British in the south. So Britain has control of Palestine and Persia, which is now going to be Iraq, and Jordan, if I remember correctly. And meanwhile, Syria and Lebanon and places north are under French control. So now we've got a situation where Britain can make good on its promise that it made in 1917 that they would make a Jewish state. And so time progresses, they're talking about this, it's getting traction, 320,000 Jewish people move to the Middle East, and especially as World War II starts to ramp up, and then especially again at the end of World War II, after the tragedy of the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews are murdered by Adolf Hitler's regime, now there is a much greater sense of the appropriateness of having a place for the Jews to come. And so more Jews come into the area, anticipating the opportunity to live there. Well, Britain finally, in a way that kind of mirrors its colonial mentality, though this wasn't actually a British colony. Again, this was assigned. They were custodians of the land by the League of Nations. Nevertheless, Britain basically took the approach of saying, well, we're in charge, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and give a land to the Jews. And so they drew up arbitrary borders in what is now Palestine and said, okay, the Palestinians can live here and here, and the Jews are going to live here, and it's a roughly 50-50 split. Problem is, they never talked to the Palestinians and the other Arabs living in the region, saying, here's what we plan to do, what do you think? They just said, here's what we're doing. And so, as we approach 1947, Britain is getting ready to pull out for two reasons. It's broke because of World War II and can't afford to stay in the area, and the now formed United Nations are going to take care of things. And then on May 14th, 1948, Britain pulls out entirely. The state of Israel is established, and there is immediately war. The Arab-Israeli war happens right out of the gate. Israel prevails. They are now established as a nation, and they actually took more territory than they were originally assigned, which, as you can imagine, didn't exactly thrill the neighboring Arab peoples and the Palestinians. Well, this does two things for the Palestinians. Number one, nobody asked them if they wanted this nation to be there in place, but there it is. And now they've taken more territory than the original agreement was given. And so they're not that thrilled. And so a number of years later, in 1967, we have the 6-Day War. And what happens there, depending on who you talk to, it's either a purely defensive war on the part of Israel, or it was a preemptive war on the part of Israel. In any case, Israel shot first, and in 6 days defended itself against 5 Arab nations, and then took all the land. They took the Golan Heights from Syria and the West Bank from Jordan and the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. And now they have property that is pretty close to what David and Solomon had, 3,000 years ago. Well, when this had been developed, you can imagine that the Israelis are feeling pretty good about it. Everybody else, not so much. And so there ends up being retaliation. In 1973, we have the Yom Kippur War, which causes a problem for Israel, and they realize how tenuous their situation is. And so they're seeking help and allies and so on. And so to help resolve this whole situation, the U.S. now gets involved, and under the President Jimmy Carter, in 1978, we have the Camp David Accords, and they start talking about having what's called a two-state solution. Let's have a Palestinian state and an Israeli state coexisting and working together as countries do, like most everybody else in the world has managed to figure out how to do. Why don't we make that happen in the Middle East? And so with that agreement, the Palestinian Authority is also established, which is the government of the Palestinian state. And the first political party to take that role on is called the Fatah Party. So time carries on, but it doesn't last. There ends up being conflict. There ends up being more arguing, rockets, all this kind of stuff. In the early 90s, it gets really, really dicey again. Now Bill Clinton is in the White House, and they try again. And with the Oslo Accords, they decide that we need to make something happen for this to really, really work. And let me correct myself. It is now with the Oslo Accord that they do the two-state solution. I made a mistake. Back in 1978, they gave the land back to where they belonged. The Golan Heights went back to Syria, the West Bank back to Jordan, the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip back to Egypt. That's what happened under Carter. It's under Clinton that they thought, let's do this two-state solution. Well, part of the reason for this whole conflict, by the way, and why it had to have another summit, is because after they gave the land back to the Palestinians that had been taken as a result of the Six-Day War, you can appreciate now the Israelis aren't very happy. We had a war. We took this territory. That was our territory. Now we've had to give it back. And so they decided to start settling Israelis in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. And when we talk about settlements, we aren't talking about some kind of temporary tent with a couple of camels or something. We're talking taking the neighborhood of Wildwood and building it right there in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. These are very, very permanent settlements, and they just kept settling it with the idea being that Israel's saying, look, that was actually our land anyway, so we're just going to go ahead and get our people in there no matter what anybody else says. That's what was causing this ongoing conflict. So anyway, the two-state solution is supposed to happen, but a couple of things take place. It breaks down again because that's what happens. The Palestinians themselves are starting to disagree, and a number of Palestinians, largely in Gaza, are upset that the Fatah party that's supposed to be representing them isn't doing a good job. So then they create another party out of protest, thinking there's a better way to do it. And in 2006, elections are held again, and in Gaza, the Hamas party is elected by 1.1 million Palestinians. Just over 40% goes to the Hamas party. It might have been votes of protest, but guess what? They became the government now. And they are part of the Muslim Brotherhood and extremists who exist to get rid of Israel. They also had a close ally in Egypt because Egypt had a Muslim Brotherhood government as well. So Israel now is dealing with two parties of Palestinian interest and having to tread carefully. But then, in 2012, 2013, the Arab Spring happens, and the Muslim Brotherhood government of Egypt is overturned, and Gaza no longer has that strong ally in Egypt. And so from 2013 to today, Israel then pulled out its settlements in Gaza and began to really put the pressure on the Gaza Strip, putting up a wall around it, beginning to control the power and the water and the trade and even the free movement of Palestinians from Gaza to West Bank and back. And with this move, over the past 10 years, the UN has declared a humanitarian emergency in the Gaza Strip because of how Israel was treating the Palestinians in Gaza. That provides the background as to why Hamas decided to attack 3 weeks ago. And in its horrific terrorist attack, indiscriminately shooting civilians and taking hostages and killing 1,400 Israelis, this was the kind of thing that prompted that attack on a purely political basis. But then, of course, Israel has responded. And if I read the news correctly, after 1,400 Israelis have been killed in the initial assault by Hamas, the Israeli assault on Gaza has resulted in 7,000 Palestinians dying. This kind of parallels what we read in 1 Kings. One king is saying, this is the way I want it to be, and the other king is saying, well, I don't agree with that, and we want to do our own thing. And then they go and do something else further that doesn't actually help the situation, but ultimately makes it worse. And in the case of Israel in the Hebrew Bible, both the northern and southern kingdoms ultimately get erased. Here in the Middle East, we've got these disagreements. And we can look and see, okay, well, I can see what, the Palestinians have a point there, but Israel has a point too, and certainly they do have a right to defend themselves, and, and it goes back and forth, and it's convoluted, and it's complex, and it's challenging. But what can we do about it? And this is the thing, as I said last week, there's nothing that we can do directly about that situation. We can obviously pray about the Middle East. We can pray for Israel and Palestine and for wise heads to think through what we ought to have happen. And right now, the general opinion of the rest of the world is there should be two states that can get along, just like everybody else generally gets along. Russia and Ukraine notwithstanding, in North and South Korea for that matter. But most of the world has figured out how to get along, right? But again, okay, we have this background. We understand more what's happening there. Is there anything about all of this that relates to us at all? I mean, when we look at the conflict between countries, we have to understand that in large part, anything that happens on a macroscopic level between nations has its roots somewhere in the microscopic level, dealing with individuals. And that is where we can take a lesson from all of this. In the gospel reading, Jesus was dealing with two things going on. One, he had a couple of his apostles that wanted to get an advantage on their colleagues, and they're asking him in advance, can both of us sit on your right and left-hand side when you take your throne? And Jesus has to kind of let them down gently that that's not up to him. And are they really sure they want that? But then the other 10 guys are upset that they're asking such a thing. And so Jesus has to say, okay, guys, cool it. Stop. This is the kind of thing other people do. You want to find out who has authority, and you want to lord it over everybody else because you're the one in charge. That is not the way it is to be with you. Instead, he says, those of you who want to be great, those who want to be first, must be the servant of all. Even the Son of Man, even I, did not come to serve, to be served, but to serve, and to give my life a ransom for many. Jesus is saying the approach that we're supposed to take in our relationship with others is to begin with the idea of service and compassion and listening. Being like what Rehoboam should have done, according to his older advisors, to listen to the people and respond to them in a way that would have resulted in their happiness in being his subjects. In the same way, when we encounter conflicts with one another and with our family members and with other friends and with colleagues at work or whatever, conflicts inevitably happen. That's part of what it is to be human. The answer is not to try to figure out how to win, but how do we come to the other in an attitude of service that enables us to figure out how the two of us can coexist together and how it is we can come to some kind of agreement to resolve the conflict, which will probably mean some kind of compromise on both sides. That's what happens. And we work hard at reconciling and moving forward with that kind of goal in mind, rather than an insistence that, well, it's got to be my way or the highway, when the other one is saying, no, it's got to be my way or the highway, and nobody comes to a solution. Now, I know that describing this like this can be oversimple, perhaps. I get that. There certainly are complex things that come, circumstances that aren't that easy to resolve just by doing it that way. I get that. But if we begin with this being our intention and our goal, our modus operandi, we are more likely to arrive at some kind of resolution between people who are in conflict that will work towards something helpful and beneficial, rather than something that just becomes increasingly destructive and unhelpful. And here's the thing, too. Again, knowing that there are complexities out there, but I would suggest that the majority of the conflicts that we encounter with others, chances are good that we might just have to let bygones be bygones and let it go and just figure out, how do we move forward from here now? Holding grudges, is never helpful. It just continues to add to the bitterness. It adds to the displeasure. It gives more and more reason for a future conflict. The best thing we can do, for the most part, is to simply let it go and let's start fresh. How do we move forward from here? The past is in the past. How do we move forward from here? Let me encourage you, in light of the example from 1 Kings chapter 12 and the divided kingdom, in light of what's been going on just over the past 150 years in Israel and Palestine, in what we see as a pattern, even throughout the scriptures, religiously going on over there, can we take Jesus' words and let them cut through all of this and lead us into a way that leads to life and health and good things, rather than allowing bitterness and grudges and revenge occupy our thoughts? Let's make that our primary goal. Let's approach it that way and see what happens. Amen.